2 in the morning has a particular weight to it. Not the chaotic urgency of midnight, not the resigned exhaustion of 3 or 4. 2 in the morning is suspended time, when the world feels both impossibly vast and intimately small. I was sitting cross-legged on our second-hand couch, surrounded by the familiar chaos of my textbooks and highlighted pages, when I heard his key in the lock. The sound cut through the apartment's quiet hum. That persistent electrical drone of the old refrigerator, the distant murmur of late-night traffic filtering up from the street below. Our third roommate, Marcus, had been asleep for hours, his door sealed shut against the world. But Elliot's absence had been a living thing in the apartment, a space that pulled at my attention every time I tried to focus on the Victorian poetry spread across the coffee table. The door opened with its familiar groan, the hinges protesting in that particular way that spoke of a building settling into decades of wear. He stepped inside, and I felt the shift in the air before I even looked up. There was something different about his movements, something careful and deliberate, as though he was carrying something fragile. When I finally raised my eyes from Tennyson's carefully measured verses, I saw him standing just inside the doorway, his jacket still buttoned against the October chill. Rain clung to his dark hair in small, perfect droplets, and the scent of cigarettes drifted toward me. Not the stale, lingering smell of a heavy smoker, but something fresher, like he'd been standing too close to someone else's habit. His face was unreadable in the dim light cast by my single desk lamp, shadows collecting in the hollows beneath his eyes. He didn't speak. Instead, he moved toward the couch with a kind of measured uncertainty, his footsteps careful on the hardwood floor we'd never quite managed to keep clean. The coffee table created a barrier between us, my books and papers scattered like evidence of a life lived in careful preparation for tomorrow's classes, tomorrow's deadlines, tomorrow's small responsibilities. Elliot dropped onto the couch beside me, without explanation, the cushions dipping under his weight, and suddenly the carefully organized geography of my study session became irrelevant. His presence filled the space in a way that made the apartment feel both smaller and more significant. The distance between us was perhaps a foot, perhaps less, but it felt charged with something I couldn't name. We sat in silence, and I became hyper-aware of every sound. The refrigerator's hum seemed louder, more insistent. Somewhere in the building, pipes knocked against the walls in their familiar rhythm. A car passed on the street below, its headlights sweeping briefly across our windows before disappearing into the night. But beneath all of that, there was something else, the sound of Elliot breathing, slightly uneven as though he'd been walking quickly or holding his breath. I wanted to ask where he'd been, wanted to understand the particular quality of tension that seemed to radiate from him like heat. But something in his posture, the way his shoulders curved inward, the way his hands rested motionless on his knees, told me that questions would shatter whatever fragile moment we'd stumbled into. Minutes passed. I found myself staring at the open pages of my textbook without reading, the words blurring into meaningless shapes under my divided attention. Elliot remained motionless beside me, his presence both comforting and unsettling. This was not unusual. He'd always been someone who moved through the world with a kind of restless energy, appearing and disappearing from our shared spaces without much explanation. But tonight felt different. Tonight, his stillness seemed intentional, purposeful. Finally, he spoke, his voice so quiet it was almost swallowed by the ambient sounds of the apartment. There's something I've never told anyone. The words hung in the air between us like a confession whispered in a cathedral, heavy with implication. My heartbeat quickened, a sudden percussion against my ribs that seemed too loud, too obvious. I kept my eyes fixed on my textbook, afraid that looking at him directly might somehow discourage whatever truth he was approaching. The silence stretched, elastic and fragile, and I found myself holding my breath. But he didn't continue. Instead, I felt the couch shift as he moved, and then there was a different kind of weight, the warm, startling pressure of his head coming to rest against my shoulder. The contact was so unexpected, so intimate, that for a moment I forgot to breathe entirely. His hair was still damp from the rain, and I could smell the night air clinging to him, mixed with something that was distinctly Elliot, soap and cotton and something warmer, more personal. The weight of his head against my shoulder felt both impossibly light and unbearably significant. Every instinct told me to move, to speak, to somehow acknowledge what was happening, but a deeper wisdom kept me frozen. This felt like trust in its most vulnerable form, like a wild animal allowing itself to be approached, ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. I remained as still as possible, barely daring to breathe, terrified that any movement might break the spell of whatever had brought him to this moment of surrender. His breathing was uneven against my arm, and I could feel the subtle tremor of exhaustion in his shoulders. There was something about the way he held himself, even in this moment of apparent vulnerability, that spoke of someone who'd been carrying something too heavy for too long. The apartment around us seemed to recede. The familiar details of our shared life, the coffee-stained table, the pile of Marcus's textbooks by the door, the houseplant Elliot had impulsively bought 3 months ago and somehow managed to keep alive, all becoming background to this single point of contact between us. I whispered into the quiet, my voice barely more substantial than breath itself. "You can tell me. I'll keep it safe." The words surprised me as I spoke them, emerging from some deep part of myself that understood, instinctively, what this moment required. He shifted slightly against my shoulder, and I felt rather than heard his intake of breath. But still, he didn't speak. Instead, his breathing began to even out, and I realized with a mixture of tenderness and desperation that he was falling asleep. Time seemed to suspend itself around us. The refrigerator continued its electric hum. The building settled with its familiar creaks and sighs, but inside our small circle of lamplight, everything had changed. Elliot's weight against my shoulder was warm and real and utterly transformative. This boy who moved through the world with such careful distance, who treated intimacy like a foreign language he'd never quite learned to speak. He was choosing to be vulnerable with me. I remained motionless, a guardian of his trust, watching the shadows shift slightly as clouds passed over the streetlights outside. My shoulder began to ache, but I would have endured far worse to preserve this fragile moment. There was something sacred about it, something that felt like the beginning of a story I didn't yet know how to tell. That night marked something, though I couldn't have named it then. Elliot woke around dawn, lifting his head from my shoulder with the careful movements of someone emerging from deep water. He looked at me for a moment, really looked at me, as if trying to remember how he'd ended up there. Then he simply said thank you and disappeared into his room, leaving me with an aching shoulder and the lingering warmth of his presence. But to understand that moment, you need to understand how we'd arrived there. How two people who should have been strangers had become something more complicated, more necessary. I am not someone who draws attention. Never have been. I move through the world quietly, preferring the company of books to the chaos of campus social life. My days follow a predictable rhythm. Morning lectures on Victorian literature, afternoons shelving returns at the university library, evenings bent over highlighted pages in our shared living room. I find comfort in the orderly progression of assigned readings, in the way a well-constructed paragraph can contain entire worlds of meaning. The library job suits me perfectly. Students come and go in waves, but I remain constant among the stacks, surrounded by the particular silence that only libraries possess. It's a silence filled with potential, with thousands of stories waiting to be discovered. I know the fiction section by heart, can navigate the poetry shelves blindfolded. The head librarian, Mrs. Chun, trusts me with a rare books collection, understanding that I handle each volume as if it were made of spun glass. My world is small by design. Coffee in the morning, brewed strong enough to fuel whatever Victorian novel I'm dissecting for Professor Williams' seminar. Lunch eaten quickly between classes, usually something forgettable from the campus food court. Evenings spent in our apartment's living room. Textbooks spread around me like a fortress against the complications of real life. This was my existence before Elliot, and it was sufficient. Safe. Predictable. Elliot arrived in September through the modern miracle of Craigslist roommate ads. Marcus had found him, and I'd agreed to the arrangement site unseen, trusting Marcus's judgment and desperate enough for cheaper rent that I didn't ask too many questions. When Elliot showed up on our doorstep with 2 guitar cases and a single duffel bag, I knew immediately that our quiet apartment would never be the same. He is everything I am not. Where I am careful, he is spontaneous. Where I plan, he improvises. He plays bass in a band called the Velvet Underground. Not the famous one. He always clarifies with a self-deprecating grin, just 4 college kids who thought they were cleverer than they actually were. They practice in garages and play at house parties, drawing crowds through sheer magnetic force rather than any particular musical genius. Elliot skips lectures with the casual confidence of someone who believes the world will bend to accommodate him. He wears his recklessness like a favorite jacket, something comfortable and worn in. His laughter fills rooms, spills over conversations, demands attention even when he's not trying to get it. People gravitate toward him at parties, drawn by something electric in his presence. But living with someone reveals their contradictions, and Elliot is full of them. His laughter often feels too loud, as if he's drowning out something else. His silences, when they come, are profound and unsettling. He'll disappear into his room for hours, music seeping through the thin walls. Not the energetic post-punk his band favors, but something quieter, more melancholic. I became attuned to these rhythms without meaning to. The sound of his key in the lock at 2 in the morning. The way he made coffee with excessive precision when he was anxious, measuring grounds like a chemist. The particular quality of silence that followed his phone calls home, conversations I never overheard but whose aftermath lingered in his shoulders, in the careful way he closed his bedroom door. Our daily interactions were polite, friendly, unremarkable. We shared the mundane intimacies of cohabitation, passing bowls of ramen across the kitchen counter, navigating the single bathroom schedule, folding laundry in the building's basement while quarters fed the ancient washing machines. He'd ask about my classes with genuine interest, and I'd inquire about his band's upcoming shows, though I never attended them. But somewhere in those small moments, I began falling for him. Not the dramatic, cinematic version of falling in love, but something quieter and more dangerous. It crept up on me through accumulated gestures. The way he remembered how I liked my coffee, the way he'd turn down his music without being asked when I was studying, the way he'd leave books he thought I might like on the kitchen counter with yellow sticky notes attached. The realization came gradually, then all at once. I would find myself listening for his footsteps on the stairs, timing my own movements around his presence. When he brought dates home, which happened regularly, a parade of confident, beautiful people who seemed to inhabit the same bright world he did, I would retreat to my room and try not to analyze the sharp ache in my chest. He never hinted at return. His relationships seemed to exist in a different category entirely from our domestic partnership. Passionate but temporary, intense but ultimately disposable. I learned to bury my feelings beneath politeness, to treat him with the same careful friendship I offered Marcus, even as my awareness of him grew more acute. This was the geography of our life together. Parallel paths that occasionally intersected over shared meals or late-night encounters in the hallway, but never quite converged. Until that October night, when something shifted, when exhaustion or loneliness or simple human need brought his head to rest against my shoulder, and I understood that perhaps I wasn't the only one carrying something unspeakable. The Friday that changed everything started like any other. I spent the morning in Professor Williams' seminar, dissecting the sexual undertones in Christina Rossetti's poetry, while my classmates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The afternoon passed quietly in the library, where I processed returns and helped underclassmen navigate the card catalog system that the university stubbornly refused to digitize completely. Elliot had mentioned a show that night, some dive bar downtown where his band was opening for a group from Portland. I nodded and made appropriate sounds of encouragement, the way I always did, while carefully not asking for details that might reveal how much I wished he'd invited me. By 10 o'clock, I was settled into my usual evening routine. Marcus had gone to a study group that would likely evolve into a party, leaving me alone with Middlemarch and a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. The apartment felt different when it was just me, larger somehow, but also more fragile, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I expected Elliot to return late and loud, possibly with company, definitely with stories I pretend not to want to hear. Instead, midnight came and went in silence. Then 1 o'clock. Then 2. It was nearly 3 when I heard the fire escape creak outside our kitchen window. The sound was so unexpected that I initially dismissed it as the building settling, or perhaps a cat navigating the metal grating we shared with the apartment next door. But then it came again, the deliberate weight of footsteps, careful but unmistakable. I found him there when I pulled back the kitchen curtain, sitting on the narrow platform with his knees drawn up to his chest, staring out at the city's scattered lights. He was still wearing his show clothes, black jeans, and the vintage Ramones t-shirt he claimed brought him luck, but something about his posture suggested the evening had not gone as planned. He looked up when the window opened, unsurprised to see me, as if he'd been waiting for me to find him there. "Can't sleep," he said without preamble. I asked if I could join him, and he nodded toward the space beside him. The fire escape was barely wide enough for 2 people, and sitting there required a careful negotiation of limbs and balance. The October air was sharp against my skin, carrying the scent of dying leaves and distant rain. Below us, the city sprawled in all directions, windows glowing like scattered stars in apartment buildings and office towers. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. This was new territory for us, shared space outside the familiar boundaries of our apartment. The city spread beneath us like a secret we were keeping together. I could feel the metal grating cold against my legs through my pajama pants, could hear the distant hum of late-night traffic and the occasional siren wailing its way through the urban landscape. Finally, Elliot spoke, his voice different from the confident tone I was accustomed to. He sounded younger somehow, more uncertain. "The show was fine," he said. "The band was tight, the crowd was responsive, everything went exactly as it should have. But afterwards, sitting in some stranger's kitchen while everyone celebrated, he felt completely alone." He turned to look at me then, and in the dim light cast by the street lamps below, I could see something raw in his expression. "I don't sleep much," he admitted. "Nights are when everything comes back, all the things I spend the day running from." I wanted to ask what things, but something in his posture warned me against pushing. Instead, I simply listened as he talked about the performance, about standing on stage and feeling simultaneously connected to everyone in the room and utterly isolated from them. About the way applause could feel like love until it stopped, leaving only the echo of your own heartbeat. "There's a part of me no one sees," he said, his voice barely audible above the city's ambient noise. No one would understand. The words hung between us like a confession, and I felt the weight of being chosen to hear them. This was Elliot without his armor, without the magnetic confidence that drew people to him like moths to flame. This was someone struggling with something he couldn't name, or couldn't bear to name. We stayed on the fire escape until the sky began to lighten, trading observations about the city's nighttime geography, the patterns of light and shadow that emerged when most people were asleep. He pointed out landmarks I'd never noticed, a neon sign that flickered irregularly in a building 6 blocks away, the rhythmic flash of a radio tower in the distance. The city became more intimate viewed from this height, more comprehensible. When we finally climbed back through the kitchen window, something had shifted between us. Not dramatically. No declarations were made, no boundaries explicitly crossed. But there was a new quality to the way he looked at me, a recognition that hadn't been there before. Later that same night, around 5 in the morning, I was startled awake by a soft knock on my bedroom door. I found Elliot standing in the hallway, barefoot and uncertain, looking younger than his 22 years. "Can I stay here tonight?" he asked, not quite meeting my eyes. I can't seem to turn my brain off. I stepped aside to let him in, and he moved past me into the room with the careful movements of someone entering a sacred space. My bedroom was small and unremarkable, a twin bed, a desk covered with books, clothes folded neatly on the single chair. But when Elliot lowered himself onto the bed, curling up on top of the covers without explanation, the space transformed into something significant. He lay there in the gray, pre-dawn light, fragile in a way I'd never seen before. His usual restless energy had been replaced by something quieter, more desperate. I remained standing by the door, unsure of the protocol for the situation, until he whispered that he just needed to know someone else was there. So I sat on the edge of the bed, then eventually laid down beside him, maintaining careful distance while offering the comfort of proximity. He fell asleep within minutes, his breathing evening out into the rhythm of genuine rest. This was the invitation I'd been waiting for without knowing it. Not a romantic gesture, but something more fundamental. Elliot's walls were cracking, and I was being pulled into the space beyond them, into whatever truth he'd been protecting so carefully. After that night on the fire escape, our rhythms changed. Not dramatically. Marcus never noticed, and our daytime interactions remained largely the same. But something fundamental had shifted in the apartment's emotional geography. Elliot began appearing at my bedroom door with increasing frequency, sometimes carrying the excuse of borrowed books or questions about assignments, sometimes offering nothing more than a quiet knock and an unspoken request for sanctuary. These visits developed their own ritual. He would slip into my room like someone seeking shelter from a storm I couldn't see, settling onto my bed or the floor beside it while I continued whatever I'd been doing, reading, writing papers, organizing notes for the next day's classes. We rarely spoke during these sessions. Instead, we existed in a kind of parallel solitude, each occupied with our own thoughts but anchored by the other's presence. I learned to read the signs that predicted his arrival. The particular quality of silence that emanated from his room after he'd been on the phone with his parents. The restless pacing I could hear through a shared wall. The way he'd make and remake his coffee in the kitchen, never quite satisfied with the result. On those nights, I would leave my door slightly ajar and wait. The fire escape became our second sanctuary. We discovered that the building's geography offered us privacy there that didn't exist anywhere else in our shared spaces. The narrow metal platform forced an intimacy that felt both accidental and inevitable. Shoulders touching, knees occasionally bumping, the warmth of another body necessary against the October chill that was deepening into November frost. We established unspoken rules for these encounters. Cheap tea in mismatched mugs, the kind of generic bags that lasted forever and tasted like cardboard but served their purpose. Books traded back and forth. I introduced him to Virginia Woolf and Margaret Atwood, while he pressed worn paperbacks of Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg into my hands, volumes that had clearly been read and reread until their spines cracked and their pages yellowed. Music became another language between us. His record collection was extensive and eclectic, spanning decades and genres with the kind of passionate curation that suggested each album had been chosen for specific emotional reasons. We would sit on the living room floor after Marcus had gone to bed, letting vinyl records play in the dark while the city hummed its nighttime symphony outside our windows. Miles Davis bleeding into Joy Division, bleeding into obscure folk artists I'd never heard of but began to associate with the particular quality of late-night introspection. During these musical sessions, Elliot would lean closer each time, as if searching for something in my presence that he couldn't find anywhere else. It was a gradual migration, first sitting near me, then beside me, then eventually using my shoulder as a backrest while we listened to whatever melancholy masterpiece he'd selected for the evening. I became acutely aware of every point of contact, every casual touch that felt anything but casual. The joy I felt during these moments was almost unbearable in its intensity. To be chosen as his confidant, to be the person he sought when the world became too much. It felt like being handed something precious and fragile, something I was terrified of dropping. But alongside that joy lived a deeper torment, the constant awareness that I wanted more than he seemed capable of giving. I began to understand that Elliot's need for my company existed in a space separate from attraction or romance. He was seeking safety, not passion, comfort, not desire. And while I was grateful to provide those things, the distinction created a particular kind of ache that followed me through my days like a persistent low-grade fever. The most dangerous moment came on a Tuesday evening in early November. We'd been listening to Joni Mitchell, Her voice filling the darkened living room with its particular brand of heartbreak made beautiful. Elliot had been quieter than usual, more withdrawn, and I've been trying to give him space while still offering the comfort of proximity. Somewhere during Blue, exhaustion overtook him. I felt the change in his breathing first, then the gradual increase in his weight against my shoulder as sleep claimed him. His head slipped down until it rested in my lap, and suddenly I was faced with the most intimate moment of my life. Elliot's face in sleep was different from his waking expression. Softer, younger, free from the careful performance he maintained during his conscious hours. His hair had fallen across his forehead in a way that seemed to invite touch, and after what felt like hours of internal debate, I allowed myself the smallest gesture of intimacy. My fingers trembled as I brushed the dark strands away from his face. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt like crossing a threshold I could never uncross. His skin was warm, real, devastatingly human. For that brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would mean to have the right to touch him this way freely, without fear or hesitation. He stirred slightly at the contact, but didn't wake, and I spent the remainder of the night frozen in position, my legs going numb beneath his weight, while I memorized every detail of the moment. The way the streetlight outside created shadows across his features. The sound of his breathing, deep and even. The impossible tenderness I felt for this complicated person who trusted me enough to be vulnerable, but not enough to be honest about what lay beneath his restlessness. It was during this period that Naomi noticed the change in our dynamic. She was a mutual friend from Professor Williams' seminar, someone who'd grown close to both of us through study groups and late-night conversations about literature and life. Naomi possessed the particular kind of intuition that made her dangerous to people keeping secrets. She cornered me after class one Thursday, her expression gentle but knowing. "Be careful," she said without preamble. "Sometimes people lean on you because they're breaking, not because they love you." The warning stayed with me, echoing through my thoughts during subsequent nights when Elliot appeared at my door seeking sanctuary. I began to examine my own motivations more carefully, to question whether my desire to help was pure or whether it was contaminated by hope for something more. But even with Naomi's words haunting me, I couldn't bring myself to turn him away. Whatever Elliot was running from, whatever battle he was fighting in the space between sleep and waking, I wanted to be his refuge. The revelation came on a Wednesday night in late November, when the first real snow of the season was beginning to dust the fire escape outside our kitchen window. Elliot had been particularly restless that week. More phone calls home that ended in tense silence. More nights pacing his room until the early hours. More appearances at my door, seeking the wordless comfort we'd grown accustomed to sharing. That evening found us in our usual position on my narrow bed, him curled against the wall while I sat with my back against the headboard, supposedly reading Sylvia Plath, but actually watching the way lamplight caught the angles of his face. The apartment was quieter than usual. Marcus had gone home for an early Thanksgiving break, leaving us alone in a way that felt both liberating and dangerous. We'd been listening to Nick Drake, his melancholic guitar work filling the spaces between our careful breathing, when Elliot suddenly spoke into the darkness. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice so quiet I almost missed it beneath the music. "Something I've never told anyone." The words hung in the air like a held breath, and I felt my pulse quicken in response. This was the moment I'd been waiting for without knowing it, the secret that lived behind all those restless nights and careful silences. I set my book aside and turned to face him fully, giving him my complete attention. He was staring at the ceiling, his hands clasped tightly over his chest, as if he were trying to hold something inside. The usual confidence that characterized his movements had evaporated, leaving someone who looked much younger than his 22 years. "I'm bisexual," he whispered, the words emerging like a confession torn from somewhere deep inside him. "But I've never told anyone, never acted on it, never even let myself think about it for very long." The air in the room seemed to shift, becoming thinner, more electric. I felt something fundamental rearrange itself in my understanding of who Elliot was, of what had been driving his restlessness all these months. The revelation was both shocking and somehow inevitable, like the final piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized I'd been solving. He continued speaking, his voice gaining strength even as his words revealed the depth of his fear. All those relationships you've seen me have, Sarah, Jessica, that girl from his economics class whose name I've forgotten, they were real, but they were also noise. Distraction. A way of proving to myself and everyone else that I was exactly who I appear to be. I remained silent, understanding instinctively that this moment required nothing from me but witness. This was Elliot's truth to tell, his burden to share, and my role was simply to receive it without judgment or premature comfort. The way he talked about his sexuality revealed years of internal struggle, of desires pushed down and denied until they transformed into the restless energy that characterized so much of his behavior. He'd known since high school, he said, but had constructed elaborate defenses against acknowledging it. The band, the casual relationships, the carefully cultivated image of someone who moved through the world without fear. All of it had been armor against a truth he wasn't ready to face. If I tell anyone, I'll lose them, he said, finally turning to look at me directly. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, and I could see the terror there, not just of rejection, but of the fundamental change that honesty would require. The weight of his trust was overwhelming. To be the first person to hear this secret, to be chosen as the repository for something so fundamental to who he was, it felt like being handed his heart and asked to keep it safe. But along with that honor came a terrible responsibility. I understood now why he'd been seeking my presence so desperately, why our friendship had taken on such urgent intimacy. He'd been testing whether I could be trusted with the most vulnerable part of himself. I didn't answer immediately. Words felt inadequate to the magnitude of what he'd shared, too small to contain the gratitude I felt for his trust or the sorrow I felt for his fear. Instead, I reached for his hand where it lay, clenched against his chest, covering it with both of mine. His hand was trembling, whether from cold or emotion, I couldn't tell. But when I wrapped my fingers around his, I felt him exhale as if he'd been holding his breath for years. The contact was simple, non-sexual, but it carried the weight of acceptance that words couldn't convey. "Thank you for telling me," I finally managed to say. "Thank you for trusting me with this." The relief that crossed his face was profound, like someone who'd been carrying an impossible weight suddenly finding help bearing the load. But alongside that relief, I could see the exhaustion that comes after any major revelation, the emotional aftermath of exposing your most guarded truth. That night, for the first time since our ritual had begun, Elliot fell asleep while I was still holding his hand. His breathing gradually slowed and deepened until he was unconscious, but his fingers remained interlaced with mine, as if even in sleep he needed the reassurance of that connection. I lay awake for hours afterward, watching snow accumulate on the window ledge while processing what had changed between us. The revelation was double-edged in ways Elliot couldn't have anticipated. Yes, I finally understood the source of his restlessness, the reason behind all those careful walls. But I also understood now that my own feelings for him existed in a realm of possibility rather than pure fantasy. The knowledge was both thrilling and terrifying. For months, I convinced myself that my attraction to Elliot was hopeless, a one-sided longing that I needed to manage and eventually overcome. But his confession had shifted the landscape entirely. The question was no longer whether he could be attracted to men, it was whether he could be attracted to me. As dawn began to creep across the snow-covered city, I realized that Elliot's revelation had given me something I'd never expected: hope. But it had also given me something far more burdensome: the responsibility of carrying his secret while navigating my own complicated feelings, walking the careful line between being his friend and wanting to be something more. The weeks following Elliot's revelation were a study in exquisite torture. Nothing changed on the surface. We maintained our evening rituals, our quiet conversations on the fire escape, our careful navigation of shared domestic space. But beneath the familiar rhythms of our friendship, I was drowning in possibility and uncertainty. Elliot continued seeking my company with the same frequency, perhaps even more so now that his secret lived in the space between us. But he never acknowledged what he'd told me that snowy November night, never referenced the confession that had fundamentally altered my understanding of who he was. It was as if the revelation existed in a separate reality, one that could only be accessed in the most private moments. I found myself analyzing every interaction for hidden meaning. When he laughed at something I said, was there an undertone I hadn't noticed before? When our hands brushed, reaching for the same book, did the contact linger a fraction of a second longer than necessary? The hypervigilance was exhausting, but I couldn't seem to turn it off. The longing I'd carried for months had transformed into something more acute, more painful. Before his confession, my attraction to Elliot had felt like loving something impossible, beautiful, but ultimately futile, like being drawn to a star. Now it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one step forward could either lift me into flight or destroy everything we'd built together. Marcus returned from Thanksgiving break with stories of family drama and leftover turkey, oblivious to the emotional tension that had settled over our apartment like fine dust. His presence forced us back into our more careful public dynamic, but the nights when he went out or fell asleep early became precious opportunities for the kind of intimacy that was becoming increasingly difficult to categorize. December arrived with a brutal cold snap that made our fire escape visits impossible. Instead, we retreated deeper into the apartment's interior spaces, finding new configurations for our conversations. Elliot would appear in the kitchen while I made late-night tea, settling against the counter in a way that brought him close enough that I could smell his shampoo. Or he'd join me on the living room couch, ostensibly to study, but actually to exist in that charged silence we'd perfected. It was during one of these living room sessions that everything came to a head. Marcus had gone to a party that would likely keep him out until dawn, and we'd settled into our usual positions. Me with a book I wasn't really reading, Elliot with his guitar, playing soft melodies that seemed designed to fill the spaces where words couldn't go. The house party started as background noise, music and laughter filtering up from the apartment below us. But as the evening wore on, the sounds grew louder, more intrusive. When someone began pounding on our door around midnight. Looking for the bathroom, Elliot suggested we join them. It seemed harmless enough, a chance to be social, to exist in a space where our complicated dynamic might find some relief through distraction. But watching Elliot at the party reminded me of everything I'd been trying to forget about who he was in public versus who he was with me. He transformed the moment we walked into that crowded living room, becoming the magnetic person who drew people into his orbit without effort. Within minutes, he was deep in conversation with a girl I'd never seen before, someone with perfect makeup and the kind of confident laugh that carried across rooms. She was beautiful in the uncomplicated way that I would never be. And when she placed her hand on Elliot's arm while talking, I felt something ugly and desperate rise in my chest. I tried to stay, tried to play the role of casual friend enjoying a party. But watching Elliot flirt with calculated charm, while I stood invisible at the edges of conversations, became unbearable. The contrast between his public performance and the vulnerable person who sought comfort in my bedroom felt like a betrayal, even though I knew I had no right to feel that way. I left without saying goodbye, slipping out while he was absorbed in animated conversation about music and art and all the things that made him interesting to people who didn't know his secrets. The walk back to our apartment was brutal. 3 blocks through December air that felt sharp enough to cut skin, my breath visible in harsh puffs that dissipated as quickly as they formed. But Elliot followed me. I heard his footsteps on the stairs minutes after I'd settled into my room, heard his familiar knock on my door. When I opened it, he was breathless from running, his cheeks flushed with cold and something that might have been panic. "Why did you leave?" he asked, and there was something raw in his voice that I'd never heard before. The question hung between us like a challenge, and I realized that this was the moment I'd been both dreading and hoping for. The careful balance we'd maintained was no longer sustainable. The tension that had been building since his confession demanded resolution, even if that resolution destroyed everything. You can't keep doing this, I told him, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. You can't keep pulling me close and pushing me away. If you want me, say it. If not, stop breaking me like this. The words emerged from some deep place I hadn't known I possessed, carrying months of accumulated longing and frustration. Elliot stepped back as if I'd physically struck him, his face cycling through expressions I couldn't read. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the threshold of my bedroom, and I could feel the entire future hanging in the balance. This was the choice point, the moment when our friendship would either evolve into something more honest or shatter completely under the weight of what couldn't be said. Then Elliot broke down, collapsing against my doorframe with a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than breath. I'm terrified, he whispered, of myself, of the world, of what it would mean to choose you. But the trembling in his voice revealed the truth he could no longer deny. And when he looked at me again, I saw my own longing reflected in his eyes. The kiss that followed was inevitable, clumsy, devastating. Not the polished romance of movies, but a collision of fear and need and months of careful restraint finally breaking apart. The kiss changed everything and nothing. When we broke apart, breathless and shaking, Elliot looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, equal parts wonder and terror, as if he'd just discovered he could fly, but was afraid of the height. We stood there in my doorway for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like snow. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he reached up to touch his own lips, as if confirming that the kiss had actually occurred, that it hadn't been some elaborate dream conjured by months of careful longing. When he finally looked at me again, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I don't know how to do this, he whispered, and the vulnerability in his voice made my chest ache. I don't know how to be what you need. I wanted to tell him that he didn't need to be anything other than himself, that the person who had been seeking refuge in my room for months was exactly who I'd fallen for. But the words felt too large, too definitive for the fragile moment we were inhabiting. Instead, I simply took his hand and led him inside, closing the door behind us with a soft click that had become the sound of sanctuary. We moved toward my bed with the careful choreography of people navigating sacred ground. There was nothing sexual about it. We were both too overwhelmed, too aware of the magnitude of what had shifted between us. Instead, we lay down together fully clothed, facing each other in the dim light that filtered through my window from the street lamps below. Elliot's breathing was uneven, and I could feel the tension radiating from his body like heat. He was fighting some internal battle I could only guess at, wrestling with years of denial and fear that wouldn't be resolved by a single kiss, no matter how transformative it had felt. I'm scared, he admitted, his voice barely audible in the darkness. I've spent so long hiding from this part of myself that I don't know how to let it exist in the light. I understood. Coming out to one person in the safety of my bedroom was entirely different from accepting that identity as a permanent part of who he was. The kiss had been brave, but it was only the beginning of a much longer, more complicated journey. We talked through the night, our voices hushed as if speaking too loudly might shatter the delicate trust we were building. Elliot told me about the years of feeling different, of watching other boys his age with a hunger he couldn't name or acknowledge, about the relationships with girls that had felt real but incomplete, loving but not quite right, about the terror of disappointing his parents, of losing friends, of becoming someone the world might not accept. I share my own story, the gradual realization of my sexuality, the relief of accepting it, the loneliness of keeping it largely private in a world that still felt unsafe for people like us. We compared experiences like cartographers mapping familiar territory, finding comfort in the recognition that neither of us was alone in this particular form of isolation. As dawn began to creep across the city, painting our walls in shades of gray and gold, Elliot's breathing finally began to even out. The internal storm that had been raging since the kiss was settling into something calmer, more manageable. His arm had found its way across my chest sometime during our conversation, and the weight of it felt both natural and revolutionary. You don't have to figure everything out tonight, I told him as his eyelids grew heavy. We have time. But even as I said it, I knew that time was both our greatest gift and our most dangerous enemy. Time to explore what this meant, but also time for fear to reassert itself, for the world beyond my bedroom to intrude on the safe space we'd created. Elliot fell asleep first, his face finally peaceful after hours of tension and revelation. I remained awake, watching the way morning light moved across his features, memorizing every detail of this moment that felt both like an ending and a beginning. The sunlight revealed things that had been hidden in darkness. The faint freckles across the bridge of his nose, the way his hair curled slightly when it was mussed, the vulnerability that sleep brought to his expression. He looked younger than his 22 years, unburdened for perhaps the first time since I'd known him. I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point, from that first night when he'd appeared at our door with 2 guitar cases and a duffel bag, through months of careful friendship and growing attraction, to this moment when the space between us had finally collapsed into something honest and real. The fear was still there, hovering at the edges of my contentment. This was only the beginning, and I knew that the world beyond my bedroom window wouldn't necessarily be kind to what we were discovering. There would be conversations with friends and family, decisions about privacy and openness, the complex navigation of being young and queer in a world that was still learning how to make space for people like us. But as I lay there with Elliot's arm warm across my chest, listening to his even breathing and watching the city wake up beyond our window, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not the resolution of all our complications, but the quiet satisfaction of finally being honest about what we meant to each other. You don't have to hide anymore, I whispered into the growing light, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking to Elliot or to myself. Not for me. He didn't respond. His breathing had already slowed into the deep rhythm of genuine sleep. But his arm tightened slightly across my chest, as if even unconsciously he was choosing to hold on rather than pull away. Outside our window, the city continued its morning transformation. Traffic began its familiar symphony. Early commuters emerged on its sidewalks. The world resumed its daily dance of movement and purpose. But inside our small sanctuary, time seemed suspended, holding space for the fragile beginning of something that might eventually learn to call itself love.